In 2011, the Hershey Company raised its chocolate prices by about 10%. The law of demand tells us that a price increase such as this will cause the quantity demanded to fall. What the Hershey Company really wants to know is how much will it fall? Will it fall by a little or will it fall by a lot? Can Hershey raise the price and sell almost as much chocolate as before? Or will the price hike cause a lot of customers to switch to Nestle or Cadbury chocolate? That depends on how sensitive consumers are to the price change by Hershey. In this module, you will learn about how economists measure this important type of sensitivity. The key idea in this module on the elasticity of demand is that an important aspect of understanding demand and how it works with consumers is how sensitive quantity demanded is to price changes. What we're going to focus on is how much people change their demand for something when the price of something goes up or down. We already know, based on the law of demand, that when the price goes up, the quantity demanded will fall. And when the price goes down, the quantity demanded will rise. But the question we don't have answered yet is, how much will it fall and how much will it rise? That is a question of sensitivity to price. And for some goods, when the price goes up, the demand falls by a lot. But there are other goods that when the price goes up, the demand doesn't fall by very much at all. And this is a concept that we call the elasticity of demand. And that's what we're going to look at in this module. So first, I will explain to you how economists measure the sensitivity of quantity demanded to price changes using this concept of elasticity of demand. Secondly, we will identify exactly what it is that makes the demand for a good more or less sensitive to changes in its price. And then finally, I will show you the connection between price sensitivity and the total revenue that a business or a firm could generate in a market. So the first thing you may be wondering about is, well, what is elasticity all about? Okay. Well, when you think of something being elastic, think of a rubber band or think of a piece of elastic. When something is very elastic, it means we can stretch it a lot. If something does not have a lot of elasticity, then it means we can't stretch it very much at all. It's very tight. So when we use this concept with respect to economics, what we're looking at is how much does the quantity demanded change? Does it stretch by a lot when there's a price change, or does it stretch by only a little? And so economists use the term elasticity of demand to measure how strongly consumers respond to a change in price. When consumers are very sensitive to the price, such that they respond to a price increase with a relatively large decrease in quantity demanded, we say that demand is elastic. But when consumers are not so sensitive to the price, so that a price increase leads to a relatively small decrease in quantity demanded, we say that demand is inelastic. When consumers respond to a price increase by decreasing the quantity demanded by the exact same percentage, demand is said to be unit elastic. As it raises its prices, Hershey would prefer to face inelastic demand so that its higher prices will cause only a relatively small decrease in the quantity sold. So the next question we have to answer is, well, what is it that makes demand more or less elastic? Why do different goods and services respond differently to price changes? Why is it that some goods have a huge decrease in demand when there's a price increase and other goods have only a small decrease in demand? So that's what we're going to look at next. When prices change, why does the quantity demanded change by a lot for some goods and by just a little for other goods? Or to put it another way, why is demand for some goods elastic and for other goods it's inelastic? Economists have identified 5 different factors that make the demand for a good more or less sensitive to price changes. The first factor that affects the elasticity of demand is whether a good can be identified as a necessity or a luxury. Goods that people cannot do without have what we call an inelastic demand. For example, people with diabetes usually purchase the medication their doctor prescribes whether the price is low or high. Likewise, goods that satisfy basic needs, such as the first few units of food, water, and shelter a person purchases, have an inelastic demand. After enough units of food, clothing, and shelter have been purchased, however, enough to assure survival, we only buy additional units if the price is reasonably low, and demand then becomes elastic. Goods that people can easily do without are considered luxuries. They include the latest electronic gadgets, the second car, and vacation travel. When prices rise, these goods can be given up, so demand tends to be elastic. If the price of a trip to Florida is too high, people will stay home. The same holds for an expensive new television. After all, it's possible to keep the old television for another year or two. The second factor that determines elasticity of demand is whether or not close substitutes for the good in question are available. A close substitute is very similar to another good, and it can easily take the other good's place. For example, for most people, oranges are a close substitute for tangerines. If the price of tangerines rises, consumers can easily switch to oranges. The demand for a good with close substitutes tends to be elastic, because a rise in the price of that good causes people to buy much less of it and redirect their dollars toward a substitute. Now, sometimes goods are what we call perfect substitutes for each other, such as red carpet pad and blue carpet pad. Since carpet pad goes under the carpet and the color cannot be seen, even a slight increase of the price of, say, red carpet pad above the price of blue carpet pad would cause rational consumers to stop buying the more expensive red carpet pad. In the extreme case, when any increase in the price of a good will lead consumers to reduce their consumption to a quantity of zero, demand is what we call perfectly elastic. And when demand is perfectly elastic, the graph for the demand curve is not downward sloping. The graph for the demand curve, in that case, is like the one here. It is perfectly horizontal. We have a perfectly horizontal demand curve here. Notice that if we go up the y-axis off of the demand curve, the demand drops to zero. So like this, if we were to go and increase the price, notice that we are no longer on the demand curve. And so the quantity demanded is equal to zero. So when this happens, we say customers are perfectly sensitive to a price increase, meaning that if the price goes up by even a penny, their demand would drop to zero. Now, there are very few cases of this in the real world, but it is an ideal case that economists use to compare other types of elasticities of demand. So when we are facing perfectly elastic demand, this is what the demand curve looks like. It is completely horizontal. When close substitutes are not available, there are no products to switch to if the price rises. Customers must either pay the higher price or go without. This is what makes demand relatively unresponsive to price changes and thus inelastic. For example, the demand for broad categories of goods with few close substitutes, such as shoes, computers, and light bulbs, is generally inelastic. However, the demand for particular brands of shoes, computers, and light bulbs is more elastic because competing brands are close substitutes. If the price of diesel brand shoes increases, you can easily switch to Nine West brand shoes. So let's go now to the third factor that can affect our demand for a good or service. And that is the amount of our income that we spend on the good. The elasticity for a good, it depends on this. And think of it this way. Expenditures on goods such as salt, envelopes, and bubble gum probably make up a very small part of your budget. As a result, your response to a change in the price of one of these items is likely to be small. In general, the demand for goods that are inexpensive and purchased infrequently is inelastic. Demand, however, is elastic for goods like breakfast cereal and cheese that are purchased with greater frequency, because price changes are more noticeable and take a bigger bite out of a consumer's budget. Demand also tends to be elastic for expensive goods, even if they are only purchased once in a while. Products such as refrigerators or automobiles make up a large portion of a consumer's budget. And because of their high prices, even a small percentage increase in price can mean paying hundreds or thousands of dollars more. Faced with the extra expense, many consumers might decide to wait to replace their refrigerator or car until their old one breaks down. This makes the demand for these goods inelastic. The next factor that affects the elasticity of demand is the amount of time available to switch to a substitute. Demand is typically less elastic over a shorter time span than over a longer one. To see why, suppose the price of gasoline rises and stays very high. Initially, people may not be able to cut back much on their purchases of gasoline. They can cancel non-essential trips. But if they commute by car to work or school, they will have to buy gasoline for that purpose until alternatives can be found. Therefore, the demand for gasoline will initially be inelastic. Over a longer time period, say many months or a year, some consumers will replace gas-guzzling cars with cars that get better gas mileage. Others will join carpools, and some might even move closer to their jobs to save on gasoline. These responses cause the quantity of gasoline demanded to fall more over time than it did initially. So the demand for gasoline becomes more elastic over a longer time period than over a shorter time period. Now, think about how you select a restaurant when you go out to dinner with your family. If your parents are paying the bill, you probably don't think too much about the restaurant's prices. The elasticity of demand is smaller when someone else is paying or helping pay for a good. Insurance coverage creates many situations in which buyers are not paying the full cost of their purchases. If you have health insurance that covers the entire cost of a doctor's checkup, then even if the price of a checkup increases, it won't increase for you. Your payment will still be zero, so the price increase will not cause you to go to the doctor less often. Your quantity demanded will stay the same regardless of the price. When there is no response to a price change, demand is said to be perfectly inelastic. And the demand curve is like the one shown here. It is vertical. So this is the opposite of a perfectly elastic demand curve. Again, it is not downward sloping like a normal demand curve. But it is also not horizontal like a perfectly elastic demand curve. Here, the demand curve is perfectly inelastic because that means that no matter how much the price increases, and notice if we go up in price, the quantity demanded stays exactly the same. If we go down in price, the quantity demanded is going to stay exactly the same. It won't move to the right, and it won't move to the left. So this is called a perfectly inelastic demand curve. Sometimes employees make decisions about purchases that are paid for by their employers. When the principals at our school purchase desks, chairs, and whiteboards, they are not spending their own money, so they might not be as responsive to price changes as they would be if the money came out of their own pockets. And when a company sends a salesperson to another city to make a sales pitch, the traveler will be relatively unconcerned about the price of hotels, meals, and rental cars, because the company is paying the bill, not the person who is traveling for the company. If the price at the most convenient hotel has increased by $20 since the last trip, the salesperson will probably stay there anyway because they don't have to pay for it. This makes the demand for business-related expenses relatively inelastic. And so one of the things we can say about the shape of demand curves is that the flatter the demand curve, the more elastic the demand for the good. The steeper the demand curve, the more vertical it is, the more inelastic the demand for a good. And if it's perfectly vertical, then we call it perfectly inelastic, and if it's perfectly horizontal, we call it perfectly elastic.